In our headlines on this Friday, March 7th, here in South Korea, the Seoul Central District Court cancels President Yoon Suk-yeol's arrest warrant, effectively releasing him from custody after his detainment in mid-January on charges of insurrection for a short-lived martial law last December. Meanwhile, amid concerns of being sidelined from efforts to address the threats posed by North Korea, South Korea's National Security Advisor Shin says Seoul and Washington will hold close consultations prior to any engagement with Pyongyang. And back on the local front, the Education Ministry says next year's medical school admission quota will be capped at 3,058 if all doctors in training end their walkout from hospitals and boycott classes. That began well over a year ago amid government plans to expand medical school seats. We start with news of the Seoul Central District Court cancelling President Yoon Suk-yeol's detainment on charges of insurrection earlier this afternoon. The president's legal team last month made a formal request to this end, asserting that prosecutors had indicted the president a day after the detention period had expired on January 25th, rendering the arrest warrant illegal. Accordingly, the court's ruling on this Friday effectively paves the path for President Yoon's release if the prosecution either waives its right of appeal or fails to file it within the set time frame. Over in the U.S., South Korean National Security Advisor Shin says Seoul and Washington will hold close consultations prior to any engagement with Pyongyang. Our correspondent Kim Do-yeon reports.
National Security Advisor Shin says the U.S. will consult with South Korea before dealing with North Korea amid concerns over U.S. President Donald Trump speaking directly to Kim Jong-un. This came as Shin met with his U.S. counterpart Michael Waltz for the first time on Thursday in Washington, D.C. local time and discussed the bilateral relationship.
We agreed to closely coordinate in advance on the formulation and implementation of North Korea policy.
In addition, Shin also said the two reaffirmed their commitment to the complete denuclearization of North Korea and the importance of the ROK-US alliance during their first in-person meeting. Meanwhile, Shin's visit follows Trump's address to Congress this week, where Trump claimed that South Korea is putting more tariffs on U.S. goods.
South Korea's average tariff is 4 times higher. Think of that, 4 times higher.
Shin says this was also discussed and worked out between the two sides. He called the situation a, quote, misunderstanding, and it has been resolved.
We provided a thorough explanation of our U.S. implementation tariffs under the Korea-U.S. FTA, and the U.S. side expressed its understanding.
A free trade agreement between the two nations leaves essentially no tariffs on U.S. goods imported into South Korea, is what Shin tried to explain to his U.S. counterpart. Shin also visited the U.S. Congress. He met with the chairman of the Senate Armed Services Committee, Roger Wicker, and requested support for Korea's involvement with shipbuilding in the U.S. Kim Do-yeon, Arirang News.
And one day after announcing a month-long exemption for automobiles from the 25% U.S. tariffs on Canada and Mexico, the Trump administration on Thursday expanded the list of imports from the two countries eligible for the brief exemption. Our Onrie has details.
U.S. President Donald Trump has granted temporary tariff exemptions for Mexico and Canada on some goods that are covered by an existing trade agreement between the three nations until April 2nd. This partly reverses the 25% tariffs he had imposed just a few days earlier.
It's just a modification short term because I didn't want to hurt the American. It would have hurt the American car companies if I did that.
Thursday's action also comes just a day after Trump decided to grant a 1-month tariff exemption on cars imported from Mexico and Canada. His tariff plans, which went into effect on March 4th, sparked widespread fears about their economic impact. Trump pointed to a failure to deal with the trafficking of drugs, particularly fentanyl, into the U.S. as a reason. A White House official expressed hope that Mexico and Canada will make enough progress on the fentanyl issue so that the matter can be removed from the agenda, allowing the U.S. to move forward with discussions on reciprocal tariffs.
Also, we discussed drugs, and they've been working much harder lately. Do you notice that? On people coming in and drugs, and we've made tremendous progress on both.
Following Thursday's measures, Mexico said it would continue cooperating, including solving drug trafficking issues. And Canadian Finance Minister Dominic LeBlanc announced on social media that Canada would pause the second round of retaliatory tariffs on U.S. goods, worth nearly $90 billion. However, senior officials say Canada's initial retaliatory tariff of 25% on around $20 billion worth of U.S. goods remains in place, which came into effect on Tuesday. Trump's reciprocal tariffs will be implemented on April 2nd for countries that charge import taxes on U.S. goods. Mexican President Claudia Sheinbaum said Mexico should be spared when such reciprocal tariffs come into effect, while the Canadian Prime Minister aims for the full removal of all tariffs. Despite efforts to reduce some tariffs, U.S. stock markets continued their recent decline on Thursday, with investors worried about the quick changes in tariffs and the uncertainty they're causing. Ga-hee, Arirang News.
In other news, the Palestinian militant group Hamas has threatened the lives of the remaining hostages in response to U.S. President Donald Trump's ultimatum issued on Wednesday. The group's spokesperson, Abu Obaida, on Thursday warned that an escalation in Israeli aggression in Gaza will, quote, most likely result in the killing of some hostages. The warning follows a long post on social media by Mr. Trump calling on Hamas to release all remaining hostages or to face death. Hamas, for its part, has accused Israel of, quote, bullying, stalling and reckless aggression. Meanwhile, peace talks for Ukraine amid Russian aggression will take place in Saudi Arabia next week. Now, this is according to President Volodymyr Zelenskyy in a recent post on his social media platform. Our Yi Sun-shin has the latest.
After the fallout from Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky's visit to the White House for talks with U.S. President Donald Trump last week, talks on a possible ceasefire for the over 3-year-long war will resume in Saudi Arabia. President Zelenskyy took to X on Thursday to announce that he will be visiting to meet Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman. He added that after the meeting, he and a delegation of senior Ukrainian officials will meet with senior U.S. officials in the Middle Eastern country to continue talks on ending the Ukraine war. U.S. Special Envoy for the Middle East Steve Witkoff also told reporters earlier in the day at the White House that Washington is currently coordinating talks with Kyiv, adding that the goal is to establish the basic framework for a peace agreement and an initial ceasefire agreement.
And from that, we're now in discussions to coordinate a meeting with the Ukrainians in Riyadh or even potentially Jeddah. So the city's moving around a little bit, but it will be Saudi Arabia. And I think the idea is to get down a framework for a peace agreement and an initial ceasefire as well.
Meanwhile, UK officials say that around 20 countries are interested in joining a coalition to help Ukraine. The plan, which is led by the UK and France, also seeks to help Ukraine in upholding any future ceasefire agreement. Not all countries involved would necessarily send troops, but could provide other support. France is also scheduled to hold a meeting next week with military chiefs of staff from European countries that are ready to provide post-war military support to Ukraine. A senior European diplomat told Reuters earlier this week that a Ukrainian peace plan being pursued by Britain and France is likely to be drawn up in days. Yi Sun-shin, Arirang News.
The Polish president has voiced hopes for swift progress in finalizing a deal with South Korea for the purchase of K2 battle tanks. Remarks to this end were shared by President Andrzej Duda during a meeting with Foreign Minister Cho Tae-yeol in Warsaw on Thursday. Back in August 2022, the two countries inked a contract worth nearly $3.4 billion, with Seoul set to deliver 180 K2 battle tanks to Poland. The two countries are now working to finalize a deal under which South Korea will export 820 additional battle tanks to Poland. The admission quota at South Korean medical schools next year will be capped at 3,058 seats if all medical students currently on strike return to the campuses or hospitals. Our Choi Soo-young reports.
Next year's new enrollment for medical schools in South Korea will be returned to their previous levels. The government announced on Friday that if medical students on leave of absence return by the end of March, there'll be no enrollment increase.
If all students return by the end of March, the 2026 enrollment will respect the university president's autonomy based on the Medical School Deans Association's recommendation.
The Ministry of Education clarified that the full return applies to all students except those on leave for unavoidable reasons such as military service, pregnancy, and childcare or illness. It added that the 2026 enrollment would be set at the increased number of 5,058 students if medical students do not return and normal classes are disrupted. The presidents of 40 universities with medical schools submitted the proposal on Thursday, restoring enrollment numbers to the previous levels, and the government accepted it. If the students return, universities will change the 2026 medical school enrollment to 3,058 students. This decision seems to have been made due to a trend where even new students enrolled this year, following last year's example, are taking a leave of absence. In February last year, the government announced plans to increase the 2025 medical school enrollment quota by 2,000. Around 10,000 residents from training hospitals and medical students nationwide walked out to protest the plan. As first-year medical students from last year took a leave of absence, this year's classes, including new students, are expected to reach up to around 7,500. The Education Ministry will review various first-year class models proposed by the Korea Association of Medical Colleges, such as retaking courses, summer and winter sessions, flexibility in the medical licensing exam, and support for universities if needed. It also stated that strict measures will be applied if students do not return despite these efforts. Choi Soo-young, Arirang News.
Also on the local front, Korea's current account surplus shrank substantially on month in January amid weaker exports. Our correspondent Moon Hye-ryun covers the latest findings.
South Korea's current account scraped a surplus for the first month of the year due to fewer working days with the national's Seollal holiday to celebrate Lunar New Year. According to data released by the Bank of Korea on Friday, the country posted a $2.94 billion current account surplus in January to mark 21 months of the account being in the black. Compared to the month before, however, this is a significant decrease, with the current account logging a more than $12 billion surplus in December. The slowdown comes as a result of 4 fewer working days in January than the year before, as the goods account surplus came to just $2.5 billion. Exports saw a downturn for the first time since September 2023, falling by more than 9% year-on-year. While IT exports such as computers and semiconductors continue to boom, non-IT products such as petroleum products and automobiles saw a decline in exports. Although the central bank expects overall growth in exports throughout the year, with February's export data from the Trade Ministry showing promising signs, uncertainties lie ahead with the Trump administration's new tariff policies.
Conflicts and negotiations between countries are not determined immediately, and it's an ongoing situation, so there are growing uncertainties. The U.S. government's tariff policies are expected to directly and indirectly, affect our exports alongside the deterioration of the global trade environment. And as discussed in our economic outlook last month, it's clear that it will play a role in slowing exports.
The central bank explains that there could be a negative impact on South Korea's exports if domestic firms respond to increased tariffs, such as the upcoming 25% tariffs on steel and aluminium, by expanding production in the U.S. And with additional U.S. tariffs on China, some of the country's export products could face competition from Chinese goods should Beijing choose to expand its exports to other countries. Imports also dropped by more than 6% as inbound shipments of coal, gas, and crude oil fell. Other than the goods balance, the services balance too recorded a deficit amounting to just over $2 billion, primarily owing to increased overseas travel with the long 설날 holiday. 문혜련, Arirang News.
And the station you're watching, Arirang TV, has signed a memorandum of understanding with the Seoul Arts Center aimed at offering audiences worldwide greater access to Korea's theatrical productions. Accordingly, starting this year, Arirang TV will broadcast select performances at the Seoul Arts Center globally with translation and subtitle services to broaden the reach of Korea's arts and culture. An American comic book artist has taken it upon himself to raise greater awareness about a Korean military hero. Our An Sung-jin covers his story.
History comics aren't entirely new, but what can be astonishing is comics about history from a complete foreigner. Onrie Kompan is an American comic book writer who has been creating comics on Admiral Yi Sun-shin, one of South Korea's greatest naval leaders, for nearly 20 years. What inspired him to create these was the drama Immortal Admiral Yi Sun-shin back in 2004.
Because I see Yi Sun-shin as a worldwide hero, and I want the world to embrace him that way. And, I want Korean people to be proud of that. I wanted to keep it as real and grounded as possible. So there's no fantasy, there's no magic, there's none of that. Everything is based on what actually happened and based in facts.
When he first started his series nearly 20 years ago, K-pop or Korean food was still unheard of for most of those abroad.
I didn't have any doubts, but everyone around me did. I was traveling to Korea and doing all this research and really investing all of myself into this. Especially in the first few years, it was very challenging.
The trilogy is divided into battles Admiral Yi Sun-shin participated in, starting from the Battle of Hansan Island to the Battle of Pyongyang and ending with the Battle of Noryang. He said he's working on the last 2 issues of the series. The comics artist has gone to more than 100 comics conventions in the US and sold 250,000 copies.
And one of the things that has been really gratifying for me is that I've seen a lot of that happen. There have been feature films made based on Yi Sun-shin that was inspired by our work, documentaries, YouTube videos and all kinds of stuff. And it's really wonderful. I'm really happy that we have kind of gotten this ball rolling.
Though he's come so far in his accomplishments, he wants to branch out more and sell more than 1 million copies. He also wants to reach out to Korean audiences to make sure that the Korean people take pride in their history. But it's not only that.
And there's still much work to do with everything, because my goal, of course, is to make Admiral Yi a worldwide recognized hero.
With efforts from Onrie and his creative team of artists and editors, comics can further come into the light and raise awareness of Korean history as well. An Sung-jin, Arirang News.
In our interview segment today, we turn the spotlight to a pair of Korean creators of a children's picture book that was recently acknowledged internationally. Our culture correspondent Song Yoo-jin files this report.
If you want to eat a red apple, what would you do? This simple question led to Korea's first top honor in the Opera Prima category at the Bologna Ragazzi Awards, one of the most prestigious international honors in picture books. Authors Jin Joo and Ga-hee broke new ground with their book, If You Want to Eat a Red Apple.
It was almost midnight and I was on a Zoom call about my next book. I saw the email and went, wait a minute. Then I just burst out cheering. It was unbelievable.
I had heard of the award before, but didn't realize how big it was. My publisher called asking, aren't you happy? At first, I was just stunned.
Jin, the writer, and Lee, the illustrator, proved to be a match made in heaven right from their very first book together. The opera prima category recognizes the debut works of either the author or the illustrator. While this is Jin's third book, it's Lee's first. The two teamed up after Jin came across Lee's photos of her children on social media. Jigu and Jiho, the apples of her eye, became the main characters of the book.
Their personalities matched the story so well that I wondered if she wrote it with them in mind. I didn't stage every shot, but after hearing the story a few times, they naturally played along.
In the book, the two very different siblings share this goal: to taste the first apple from a tree planted by their grandfather. Jigu, the older brother, is observant, taking in everything and everyone around him. Jiho, on the other hand, charges straight ahead once he sets his goal.
I once thought I should just live for me now. But through this book, I realized that caring for others is what makes me, my red apple. For those feeling lost, I hope they remind themselves they're doing just fine. For young readers, I hope they cherish their differences, grow together, and one day share their red apples.
The duo also push boundaries with their creative process, from using photos instead of illustrations to typography.
Film photography has a raw, painterly quality. To keep that analog feel, I cut out shapes by hand, layering them onto the photos to create a storybook-like world. With my design background, I wanted the text and images to blend seamlessly like a poster, so I created fonts as well.
Now, in their brightest spotlight yet, the authors hope to share the light.
I hope us winning this award gives strength and confidence to other emerging authors and illustrators on the same path. To readers, I humbly ask them to take a moment to notice these quieter voices shining like fireflies.
Just as it takes two to tango, a picture book is a dance between words and images. Now working on their second book together, Jin and Lee are set to create another Apple Salute classic. 송유진, Arirang News.
This is The World Now, bringing you the latest stories around the globe. Russian President Vladimir Putin has criticized French President Emmanuel Macron following his warning about the threat Russia poses to France and Europe. In a televised address on Wednesday evening, Macron described Russia as a direct threat to Europe. He also announced his decision to open a strategic debate on nuclear deterrence to protect European allies, adding that France must be prepared for the possibility that the United States may no longer stand by its side. In response, Putin on Thursday mocked Macron's remarks by drawing a comparison to Napoleon Bonaparte's failed attempt to conquer Russia in 1812. The Kremlin also denounced Macron's speech as highly confrontational, accusing him of wanting the war in Ukraine to continue. Over in Switzerland, a planned conference on the application of the Geneva Conventions to the occupied Palestinian territories was cancelled just one day before it was scheduled to take place. Switzerland announced the cancellation on Thursday, citing a lack of participants after some countries expressed concerns. The Swiss government had invited 196 signatories of the Geneva Conventions to attend the March 7th meeting in Geneva, which aimed to discuss the situation of civilians in the West Bank, Gaza, and East Jerusalem. The conference was set to focus on the Fourth Geneva Convention, which outlines humanitarian protections for civilians in conflicts or occupied territories. Israel, one of the signatory states, did not immediately comment on the cancellation. However, it had previously criticized the conference, calling it part of the legal warfare against Israel. A lunar lander developed by U.S. space exploration company Intuitive Machines touched down on the moon on Thursday local time, but its success remains uncertain. The U.S. company said it is unclear whether the Athena lander had touched down upright near the lunar south pole or had tipped over, as happened to its first lander last year. This marks the second moon landing under NASA's commercial lunar delivery program. Last Sunday, another Texas-based company, Firefly Aerospace, successfully landed its Blue Ghost lander on the northeastern edge of the near side of the moon. In Brazil, carnival fever has once again swept through Rio de Janeiro. Starting on the last day of February, hundreds of street parties known as blocos paraded through the city streets with unique themes and musical styles. The lively celebrations attracted thousands of revelers. The highlight of Carnival was the fierce competition among the top 12 samba schools at the Samba Drum Stadium. After a thrilling performance, the Beija-Flor Samba School was crowned the winner for the 15th time, and the results announced Wednesday. The festive will continue until Saturday. Yoon, Arirang News.
The morning started chilly, but daytime temperatures rose to double digits across the country, feeling like early spring. It's going to get warmer day by day. Seoul will rise up to 11 degrees Celsius tomorrow and 12 degrees on Sunday. It will feel warm enough to enjoy outdoor activities. However, as the morning temperature stays in single digits, please keep in mind the daily temperature differences. With the warmer weather, the air is covered with fine dust. While the concentration of ultrafine dust has risen to bad levels in the western regions, caution is necessary as it is likely to continue for a long time during the weekend and next week. Look at the lows. Seoul and Daejeon will start off at 2 degrees tomorrow morning. Highs will exceed 11 degrees all over the country, and it will even be a bit warmer on Sunday. There's rain forecast for Chungcheongnam-do province, southern regions, and Jeju Island tomorrow. That's all for Korea. Here are the weather conditions around the world.
Right, those are the headlines at this hour here in South Korea. Coming up now is our daily panel session. Do stay with us.
산에 오면 굉장히 일단 자연의 소리로 가득 차고 조용하거든요. 저도 그렇고 많은 사람들이 산을 통해서 많은 에너지를 얻고 또 다시 일상으로 돌아갔을 때 리프레시하는 그런 것들을 많이 얻어가는 것 같아요. 어느 날부터는 이런 아름다운 풍경 속에 정말 이질적인 하나의 모습이 눈에 들어오더라고요. 우리 인간들이 버린 쓰레기들. 제가 좋아하는 산을 즐기기만 하는 게 아니라 계속 즐기려면 제가 지켜야 하는 부분이 있으니까 나라도 조금 무언가를 해보자. 그리고 마음이 맞는 사람들이랑 같이 한 번에 변화시킬 수는 없을지라도 뭔가 우리가 계속 할 수 있는 일들을 해보자라고 했던 게 클린 하이킹이었던 것 같아요. 결국에는 사람들이 쉽게 사용했다가 내가 즐기고 맛보고 그냥 쉽게 편하게 사용하고 버려지는 것들이 가장 불편하기도 하고 우리가 심각하다고 생각하는 부분인 것 같아요. 쓰레기들을 보면 화가 나기도 하지만 또 이게 혼자 줍는 게 아니라 같이 줍다 보면 되게 재밌는 부분이 정말 오래된 막 50년도 더 된 쓰레기들을 발굴을 할 때가 있거든요. 2001년! 2001년! 우리가 태어난 연도보다 더 오래된 것들도 있고 이러다 보니까 같이 줍다 보면 더 그런 특이한 쓰레기, 재밌는 쓰레기를 찾으려고 게임처럼 막 하게 돼요. 자주 산에 찾고 자연을 찾고 즐기는 것도 중요하지만 조금 더 사내 살아갈 수 있는 쉬운 실천법들이 있거든요. 자연 속에서 자신도 즐기고 또 자연을 지킬 수 있는 활동을 좀 더 놀이로서 재밌고 즐겁고 유쾌하게 이런 환경이란 게 너무 딱딱하고 내가 뭔가 힘을 들여서 해야 되는 일이 아니라 우리가 즐기면서 함께 할 수 있는 놀이처럼 그렇게 느낄 수 있는 자리를 많이 마련하는 그런 클린 하이커가 되고 싶습니다.
나는 우리로 노는 크리minal.
Come tomorrow, that is Saturday, March 8th, the world celebrates International Women's Day. And in light of this occasion, on Press Perspective today, we touch upon issues related to gender equality here in South Korea. Do stay with us. Hello, you're watching Press Perspective. It is Friday, March 7th here in Seoul. I'm Min Sun-hee. The World Economic Forum believes there has been some progress in narrowing gender gaps, but at the current pace, full gender equality will be reached in the year 2158. Now, that's 133 years from now. Well, against that backdrop, we revisit the issues surrounding gender parity or disparity, if you will, here in South Korea. For more on this, I have Kelly Kasulis-Jo with the Washington Post in the studio. Kelly, welcome back.
Happy to be here. Thanks.
I also have writer Colin Marshall with the Pundit's Take. Colin, it's great to have you here.
Glad to be here. Thank you.
Kelly, we'll start with you. Let's begin with South Korea's standing with regard to gender equality as compared to its global and regional counterparts.
Yeah, so the World Economic Forum puts out this gender equality index. If you try to download it, I mean, it's extremely long. It's looking at so many factors, and it's quite a comprehensive breakdown of different ways that you can kind of look at gender equality around the world. It measures 146 nations, and South Korea, in its latest report, ranks at about 94. That's actually quite surprising. I think South Korea ranks behind Honduras, the United Arab Emirates, for instance. Certainly the United States, which ranked at 43. But you know, these things look at things in a very scientific, measurable way that maybe doesn't play out in our anecdotal, qualitative way of looking at life. But the way that they attempt to show gender inequality or equality is by looking at four main areas. It's economic participation, the level of educational attainment, health and survival, as well as political involvement. For South Korea in particular, one interesting thing is economic participation was the worst category for South Korea compared to other countries. And as someone who's been a reporter here for 8 years, I think that really speaks to a chronic issue that I hear from Korean people as well as see in the media again and again, which is women often are expected to kind of end their careers once they become mothers. They get pushed out of the workforce, or if they manage to have one child and take maternity leave and they want to grow their family, they feel like they can't have a second one often because they think that that will be the end of their career, that the workplace or the company that they're at will see them as a less valuable asset compared to men, or may not welcome them back. And we also see, you know, there's been kind of a culture war happening in South Korea between the genders in the past few years. We certainly saw it play itself out in the last election cycle, where issues of abolishing the gender ministry was a big part of President Yoon's campaign. And so you'll see that South Korean women are actually linking up with men romantically less and less. And this plays itself out in the economic way, and that when people aren't marrying because they perceive marriage to be a compromise to their careers, they're certainly also not starting families. They're not, because they see this as a threat to their economic participation, so to speak.
Right, and staying with economic participation, Colin, the gap in pay depending on gender here in South Korea continues to make headlines. How concerned do you suppose should we be?
I would say our concern should depend on what causes the gap. And thinking about this sends my mind back to World War II, not for the reasons viewers might assume, but during World War II in the Pacific Islands, on islands that were occupied by the U.S. military, there were these islanders, these tribes of islanders who witnessed what was going on with the military there, that they would build airstrips, build air traffic control towers, and then they would perform these operations, these rituals it looked like, and suddenly these giant birds would come down. We know them as airplanes. The birds would come and drop food and clothing and all kinds of fruits of modernity. When the war ended and the U.S. Army left, the military left, the islanders were still there, of course, and they were thinking, well, how do we get that good stuff again? How do we get the food and the clothing and all that stuff? Well, why don't we cut our own runway out of the jungle? Why don't we build our own control towers out of wood? Why don't we have air traffic controllers wearing sort of coconut headphones? They built replicas of all this equipment in hopes that the gods would then return the giant their metal emissaries to drop food and whatnot. This is the cargo cult, the idea of the cargo cult. It's an old anthropological idea. And the cargo cult essentially means, what is cargo cult thinking? It is where you imitate the forms you see before you without an understanding of the mechanics behind what's happening. And when Korea, or official Korea, as I like to say, interprets its OECD statistics especially, something of the cargo cult always comes back to my mind, because with a stat like adult literacy, we have an unambiguous good. And if you are lacking in that stat, something's gone wrong if adults can't read. With the pay gap, the stat itself is not enough to tell you anything. You need to know why it is. There could be bad reasons for it. There could be women getting offered less money for the same work. It could be women not being promoted. These are undesirable reasons and should be corrected if they're found. But there's also the factor that women and men do go into different kinds of work. Careers can take different shapes, as well as Kelly pointed out. Sometimes women are expected to end their careers early, so whether they're being forced to, whether they're doing it voluntarily, that's another issue to tease out. But I think of airlines, for example. When you fly a major Korean airline, one of them, you'll notice, compared to US airlines, the flight attendants are quite young. The average age is much lower. And because it's not considered to be a career, per se, you're expected to work as a flight attendant, as a woman, until you get married, or definitely only until you have a family. At that point, you've got to sort of move along. Whereas in the US, it can be a career. A friend of mine, a childhood friend, American, of course. His mom, he was raised by a single mom. His mom was a flight attendant. She worked for an American airline for 36 years as a flight attendant. So she got a career out of it. She got paychecks the whole time, of course. She retired, but she hated it. And it drove her to drink. I mean, doing that job that long was not, she didn't like it. It was harmful to some degree. So was that the best life outcome for her? I'm not sure, but it does show you a difference between these societies and how sort of women's careers are regarded, for better or for worse.
Right. And also moving forward, Kelly, there are some observers who believe that the gender gap, it's also to blame for the rise in female suicides as well as digital sex crimes targeting women. How do you respond to this?
Yeah, well, suicide in particular is a very tricky topic. I feel South Korea is known to have the highest, sometimes the second highest suicide rate in the OECD. And this is a chronic issue that I think is multi-pronged. So although gender inequities might be a part of it, I can't say that that is the driving cause. Certainly, I think South Korea, like many other patriarchal societies around the world, has a problem with misogyny, with women being second-class citizens in some respect to, getting paid less, domestic violence and sexual violence not being taken seriously as a very important public health issue. So in relation to the suicide epidemic, I mean, I'm sure that there is some kind of correlation there. We do see, on the topic of digital sex crimes specifically, this is something that South Korea is recurrently in the news for over the last decade or so. We've seen in the last couple of years the controversy over Nbangbang, or the Nth Room, which was kind of the series of Telegram app chat rooms that were circulating often non-consensual, sexually explicit images of women or even female minors. We saw recent controversies with deepfakes, and there were individual cases where there were suicides reported related to women having their likeness used on sexually explicit material using AI technology, which is a fairly new front of how we're seeing this problem. And then I remember when I first came to Korea as a correspondent, the word of the time was molka, right? Mole cameras. I'd never even heard of a mole camera outside of like a KGB spy movie context before then. But these are very tiny cameras. They look like a little dot. They were repeatedly being found in hotel rooms, bathrooms, and I remember it was kind of almost a public relations campaign in the city of Seoul that they had women in vests going out and using metal detectors and looking for these, or stickers in women's public bathroom stalls saying, don't worry, here's the time that this was last checked, and there would be like a little, timestamp update, and people would stuff toilet paper into like little holes that they would see in doors or in the stucco of walls. So I mean, this is kind of a chronic issue. What we're seeing is that technology is evolving, and so the way that this is playing itself out evolves. And in general, I mean, studies show that women who are threatened with non-consensual sexual material of themselves, or women who sexual images of themselves are non-consensually released in public, there is a correlation there between that and suicidal ideation or behaviors. But I mean, I don't think you necessarily need research to back that up. I mean, sexual crimes in general are probably among some of the worst things that you can do to men or women, period. And so, South Korea, this continually makes international headlines here. It's an issue in the US and everywhere else as well. I think with Korea, you see kind of this highly wired, highly technologically forward society, and then when that meets misogyny or violence against women, it creates a very ugly picture.
Right. Unfortunately, of course. But it's also a universal problem, as you mentioned. Colin, following the brief imposition of martial law last December, quite a number of foreign media outlets shed light on the tangible presence of female protesters out on the streets, rallying against, of course, the imposition of martial law. How do you care to explain this phenomenon?
Right, it was certainly an angle taken by foreign media, in part because Yoon was by then long regarded as being anti-woman, so said by his detractors, and different detractors substantiate that differently. One reason that's often pointed to is his campaign promise of scrapping the Ministry of Gender Equality and Family, I believe they call it in English. And his supporters would say, well, that's because it wasn't doing its job. It wasn't creating inequality. His detractors would, of course, say that's just an excuse. He wants to abolish it to abolish gender equality itself. And I could see arguments being made either way, although I should note that the one person I know who worked on Yoon's campaign is in fact a woman and highly educated both in Korea and the US, and she was of the mind that the argument was correct, that this ministry was not doing anything to further gender equality. And so the idea, at least as far as it goes, that getting rid of it was a step to replacing it with something that could work, she accepted that. Now, what she thinks of his current performance, I'm not sure, but I had no choice really but to accept her perspective on that one. And in any case, I think in politics, especially when it's politics viewed from the lens of another country's media, a politician or a political player gets one image and they're stuck with it. And so I don't think Yoon could do anything to be regarded as anything other than anti-woman, anti-equality. He's often described as an extreme right-winger by foreign media as well, and we can get to the relationship between gender and sort of left and right on the spectrum later. But I think, you know, once you're tagged rightly or wrongly, it's very hard to shake that image.
Right, and staying with leaders, but going beyond borders, Kelly, following Trump's election victory in late last year, there was a bit of US media coverage about a fringe movement here in South Korea that was gathering quite a bit of a following in the US as well. I believe you covered a related story also. Could you tell us a bit more about the 4B movement, so to speak?
Yeah, so the 4B movement is kind of this online native digital grassroots movement that I think is fair to say is more of a fringe form of online feminism in South Korea. And it started around the 2010s and has gotten attention recently because Americans have kind of discovered it, resonated with it, and forwarded it as an idea on TikTok and other social media platforms. So when Trump was reelected this past November, a lot of young women felt like this was a referendum, so to speak, on women's sexual reproductive rights, as well as women's rights in general, because we know that Trump, for instance, is against Roe v. Wade and, you know, a lot of other women's issues at this time. And so this kind of movement has been kind of co-opted in the American context, but at its core, it's this idea that the 4Bs, this is a little complicated. So in Korean, the B is meant to represent no, basically. And so, for instance, the word in Korean for marriage is 결혼. So they'll say 피혼, like against marriage. And so the 4Bs are no marriage, no dating, no reproducing with men, and I think the other one is no sex. I have actually never met a woman who identifies as part of the 4B movement. I've met South Korean women who identify as 피혼 or against marriage. So maybe they're okay with dating or sexual relations with a man, but they believe that marriage is fundamentally against them, that it's something that they don't want to live out, that it doesn't advantage them in any way. And so, you know, I can't give numbers on how many women actually follow this. I think naturally what we're seeing in South Korea is that women and men are separating and getting married less and less because women see marriage as another set of responsibilities that they have to take on while still working. And in general, loneliness is sort of an epidemic in this country and among younger people, probably around the world in general. So I mentioned that this really cropped up in the 2010s. There are certain things that have kind of stoked this movement, as well as the feminist movement in South Korea in general. In 2016, there was that really terrible murder of a 23-year-old woman in Gangnam Station, and the older male assailant murdered her at random and had said something to the effect of he was tired of being rejected by women. At this time, this really fueled a lot of mass protests against violence against women and just kind of women's lesser place in society. We saw this again 2 years later when the Me Too movement in the U.S. kind of spilled over into South Korea. We saw a lot of women coming out and talking about things that had been happening to them. And again, we saw this mass mobilization of young women in particular, but women in general in South Korea speaking out, speaking up for their rights. And, you know, 4B is kind of an offshoot of this in a way where I think some people would say it's extreme, but the response is to basically swear off of men altogether.
Right, and beyond the 4B movement here in Korea, Colin, in recent years, there has been quite a bit of coverage about the growing ideological divide between men and women in general. How severe is this reality, and what do you believe are the reasons behind it?
Well, in a way, I'm surprised that men and women were more politically on the same page before. I'm surprised how much they seemed to agree before. Just today, I scrolled by this scientific paper somebody was posting about how in the U.S., this was an experiment done in the U.S. that seemed to show that supplementary testosterone use made Democratic voters more likely to vote Republican. It made them vote more right-wing, the more testosterone they were using. So that's an interesting result. It brought to mind a conversation I had here with a longtime foreign Korea observer, been here more than 40 years. We were talking about Trump and all that, and he was saying his theory was that in the U.S. and other countries, the left-wing party tends to be the sort of mother party, and the right-wing party the father party. They bring different types of authority to bear, different sort of worldviews to bear. And you have too long of one, eventually people get sick of it and they want the other. We've had mom too long in the power seat, we're going to have dad there. And then you get sick of dad, you want mom back. And so I think there is a basic divide here between men and women that is going to get expressed politically, that naturally gets expressed politically, for instance, the more women participate in politics. And so I think this is something we may have to just accommodate ourselves to, that men and women vote differently, and we're going to get political parties or centers of power that play to that, that know how to appeal to each side. And different countries have handled this differently, but you can see, I think in Korea, the more women participate in politics, the more of an apparent divide, the more deep the divide seems to be, although maybe that's just revealing disagreements that already existed that hadn't been expressed before, hadn't been allowed to be expressed, or there wasn't the political pathways to express it before.
Right. Kelly, as you mentioned earlier, there are pundits who believe that the low birth rate here in South Korea can be linked to the severe gender gap. Do you suppose better addressing this particular gap, perhaps better offering women an opportunity to work as well as raise a family, would perhaps better address the low birth rate in the country?
Certainly, I think the proof is in the pudding that a lot of women are not having children because there is an economic need for both people in a family, the man and the woman in a nuclear heterosexual family, to work these days. The cost of living is very high. And if one person sees having a child as the end or a major disruption to their career, I mean, they're probably not going to do it, or they're certainly not going to have more than one child if they can even manage that sacrifice. There's been plenty of research about this. I think, you know, that is a clear issue that's happening here. The other thing is that, you know, I think this is common knowledge at this point. South Korea has the lowest birth rate in the world. We celebrated last week the fact that it went up slightly in the last year or so, but that might have just been because of post-pandemic marriages. South Korea's birth rate is about 0.75, so imagine it's 3/4 of a baby per woman. To compare, the U.S., it's 1.66, and the U.S. is also worried about its birth rate lately. And one of the things beyond just career disruptions that we discussed in recent weeks was, you know, for instance, there's this economist, Claudia Goodwin, and she did some interesting research basically suggesting that there's a clear correlation between the amount of extra work a woman does in the home over her husband and there being a low birth rate. So if you look at a country like France, there's a lot more parity in the amount of work that men and women are sharing in the home, and they have a pretty decent birth rate. In South Korea, there's a big disparity between the amount of work that women and men on average are doing in the home, and the birth rate's incredibly low. And that phenomenon is also observable in Italy, Portugal, and many other countries. So I do think that the birth rate and gender inequality, there's no doubt there's a relationship there. Unfortunately, some of these solutions are quite difficult because it's not just about government policy, it's also about shifting the culture in the workplace, in the home, in terms of patriarchy, in the family. We need to make marriage and child rearing more appealing to women for them to want to do it at this point. That's clear.
Right. It seems like we need to have a more comprehensive framework to deal with the low birth rate then. All right, I'm afraid that's all the time we have. Kelly, as always, thank you very much for your insights.
Thank you.
And Colin, thank you very much for your time and thoughts.
Thank you.
Right, well, that brings us to the end of this edition of Press Perspective. Thank you for watching. Have a good weekend.
How to survive in Korea. Weddings. Step 0. Attire. As a guest, dress formal to business